and this month it's all about turf or turf alternatives. We invite expert guests to talk about the topic, and then we open it up to our audience to take questions via our chat or asking directly. So I can help moderate that. It's also an opportunity to share best practices. So it's not just about Q&A, it's about sharing information. Together, we can make more of an impact than working on our own. And it would be wonderful to see where all of you are joining us from today. So I invite you to do that in the chat box now. And please check that your mic is on mute so that we can limit any feedback. I'm admitting more people. Great. And yeah, so put where you're from in the chat box. Note also, like I said, we're recording this session. We record all our sessions and then they're posted on the SOL website after the presentation. So I'm just checking to see where that feedback's coming from. All good. When you go to the SOL website, that's also where you can see the upcoming monthly themes as well. And so I invite you to please share these recordings widely with your networks. There's such valuable information that we always get to in these 45-minute sessions that you know, we can forget so easily. And as a land acknowledgement, I want to say I'm coming from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people. I'm in Wolfe Island, Ontario, and our guest is joining me from across the river, the St. Lawrence River. Our guest is Joyce Hostyn, expert rewilder, designing change. Joyce is a rewilder and a designer who believes we can change ourselves, our organizations, and our cities by design. She also works as an adjunct professor at Queen's University in the Master of Earth and Energy Resources Leadership Program. She's also the co-founder of Little Forest Kingston, and collaborations between plants, soil, organisms, climate, geology, land, and people is what it's all about. Welcome, welcome, my special friend Joyce Hostyn. And you are going to talk to us, introduce us maybe to some about rewilding, wildscaping. Please explain. We want to hear all about the why and the how. Let's get into it.
Thanks so much, Astrid. And I'd say this is less how and more about why. And I have wildscaping on the front, but really I think about it more as rewilding. And that's a wild plum that appeared in my yard, and probably, I think it's a little bit representative of the shift in how I see the land and see plants over time. And that when it first appeared, I tried to weed it out thinking, you know, it didn't belong. It came here on its own, versus now starting to ask the land questions when somebody like that appears. This is the third year I've had this problem. Do these bees work mostly at night, or is there another pest? This is the question that, as a master gardener, I'm also a master gardener, that we may often get, those little round holes in a red bud. So there's the holes in the leaves that those pests, those annoying little creatures might have done. But what the bee may see, what that pest may say, is, why are you calling me a pest for destroying my home? So they're one of the best. This is a leaf cutter bee, and they're one of our best pollinators. And the leaves, they're used for their nurseries. So they're not a pest taking away or cutting holes in our leaves, despite what we may think. So one of the things I'm doing more and more of is talking about the insects and the other creatures and all the other beings that live with us, and advocate on behalf of them, because they can't speak for themselves. They can't speak human. RHS over in UK, they, for the first time this year, have stopped doing their top 10 pest list, and instead they're calling them, I think, garden visitors, rethinking about how they view creatures like that, which I think is a really big step forward. Richard Powers' Overstory, if you've read his book, a number of wonderful, wonderful phrases in his book. And I like what he says here. There are no individuals in a forest, no separable events. The bird and the branch it sits on are a joined thing. A third or more of the food of a big tree mix goes to feed other organisms. Even different kinds of trees form partnerships. And this, I think about this as magic. All of this, in all these relationships, all this invisibility and the way it weaves together, magic. In its perhaps most primordial sense is experience of existing in a world made up of multiple intelligences. The intuition that every form one perceives, from the swallow swooping overhead to the robber fly hunting prey, the Luna moth overwintering in leaves, forest ants planting our spring wildflowers, hornworms hosting brachnoid wasp babies, predator beetles lying in wait for prey, to the fly on a blade of grass. And indeed, the blade of grass itself is an experiencing form, an entity with its own predilections and sensations, not just for the other persons, but for other sentient organisms, albeit sensations that are very different from our own. David Abrams' Spell of the Sensuous, a wonderful book if you've not read it, really helping us or getting us to think about the sensuousness, the magic of the natural world. But most of us in North America have lost our belief in magic as we learn to discipline plants. The world has been created by violent ecological simplification. So that's a palm plantation. A world displaced, coerced, and violently disciplined plants. And all the chemicals and the products and everything else that we've been convinced somehow to use to discipline the yards around us. I like what Bill Levy says here. And the North American lawn is one of the greatest mass brainwashings of all time. And these are four pictures from around the world: Saudi Arabia, Texas, Kingston, and I think Toronto. You can hardly tell them apart, other than if you aren't good at telling the trees, the palm trees, and the one in particular. So this we brought with us to North America as settlers, those of us who are settlers. And one of the words that's used to talk about this is the egotistical worldview, the worldview where man, not people even, but man are on top, and women and children, and then all the other creatures below. So very hierarchical worldview. Settlers wanting to impose order over a big, dark, scary, natural, wild, what we saw as wild place that seemed to us devoid of logic. So this mentality shaped all of our cities around North America. And as a result, you think about a swallow flying ahead. What do they see? No food, no water, poison with chemicals, no shelter, no place to build a nest, no insects to feed their young. For the bees, a food desert when they fly over this. Nothing for these butterflies here, or a little bit of a, annual patch over there. So biodiversity, probably everyone on this call is declining faster than any time in history. The wondrous, teeming, calamities threaten variety of life on Earth, and even red-winged blackbirds, which we see as common, but even they are having troubles. Lost insects, lost spiders, lost bees, lost fireflies. So the question becomes, and Canada has signed on to 30 by 30, to conserve or protect at least 30% of the natural world by 2030. I don't think this is fast, because until then we're still declining. So the question becomes, how do we restore relationships? How do we become nature positive in our cities? And to me, wildscaping, rewilding is part of that. Those are Astrid's hens there, in case you don't recognize them, our wonderful host. There's another way Robin Wall-Kimmerer says of putting your hands in the earth and getting to work and saying, yeah, I made a lot of mistakes, but we can be healers too. And Maureen, another co-founder, says trees are medicine for children, children are medicine for trees. Plants are medicine and for us, and we can be medicine for them. So wildscaping, I think, is that integral relationship between each of us. And Kenneth Olwick, who's a philosopher around landscape, says it can be conceived as a nexus of community, justice, nature, and environmental equity, a contested territory. And the contestation that I'm looking for is, how do we question all of these conventional practices and bring back the wilds to our cities? So this is where I live, a typical suburban neighborhood. which, you know, at one point in time would have supported all of these different creatures that I've already mentioned. And when I moved in, this is what it looked like. I would say at least half was asphalt, semicircular driveway, 2 wings, lots of grass with some foundation plantings, and then the required tree in the middle of the front yard. And this is my spouse there, who, when I started, wanted a normal front yard, which became anything but normal. And I first started out probably like many gardeners, going to nurseries and just taking one of everything that I saw that caught my eye. But eventually I learned to listen to some of the other creatures, such as, in particular in my yard, the squirrels, who had other ideas of what the landscape should be or could become. And so after 20 plus years of negotiation, this is the new normal of my yard. It's a forest, which is what it had once been. So wildscapes I see as Earth's technology for resilience, and just listen to the sound. My sister, when she visited, would walk back up and down the street 3 times, listening to the change of sound between my yard and the yards down the street. Gavin Van Horn says one conception of wildness is simply an acknowledgement that the land has a will of its own. A question that begins a dialogue with the land. What does this landscape want to be, if given the opportunity? And how often do we ask that question of the land when we assume stewardship of a new place, when we move into a new place and assume stewardship of that land? So wildscaping enters us into a conversation with the land and introduces us to new friends, such as all the diversity of bees and other creatures that may come. So I like this cartoon of the unrolling of the monoculture grass lawns and see what each one may become as it gets unrolled. It helps us heal our relationship with other living beings, like this Prometheus silk moth, who I discovered in my backyard just off the patio last year, who I never knew about before, and then I saw them and so had to look them up and discovered that some of their common hosts are the tulip tree, sassafras, and spice bush, and I have both spice bush and tulip tree in my backyard. So this year I'm going to have to be going and checking to see if there's a cocoon sitting here, like this spice bush, I think has cocoons. Wildscaping allows the land to express itself, and my son, he stopped mowing his yard. He's actually now smothered most of the grass, but along the top of the ditch, which wasn't smothered, it was left, this blue-eyed grass decided to make an appearance. Wildscaping also maximizes genetic diversity, so species are better suited to adapting climate conditions like this. This is the butternut, and the butternut, as probably most of you know, is endangered now because of butternut canker. But without having the genetic diversity of so many butternuts, we wouldn't have the resistance that they have now from the remaining butternuts, the ones that were resistant, and now we can propagate new seedlings and potentially bring the butternuts back. Wildscaping also asks us to learn the history of the land. Astrid gave a land acknowledgement, and one of the things within land acknowledgement is also learning about the history of the peoples of the land and all the trees, the forests, the meadows, the rivers, the creatures of the land. Wildscaping recognizes landscape as and this is another one from Kenneth Olwith that I like, multi-species gathering in the making. It's a multi-species gathering. So it's not just about people, it's not just about plants, but it's created and made by and stewarded by many different creatures. It's regenerative, and I like this 2-minute video on regeneration. What the video, it was really, all the video was saying was stepping up through the different levels, sustainability up to regeneration, with regeneration saying that it's a whole reframing of our relationship with the natural world and supporting this move from egotistical to ecotistical worldview. Wildscaping to me invites wonder and magic back to our cities, like this creature. I don't know how many of you know who this is. But they love to eat slugs and snails and earthworms. And so with those jumping earthworms coming in particular, but over in UK, I would welcome them as well because they suffer from the slugs, which they used to call pests. But this is the firefly larvae. And when the land speaks, we begin to experience magic or the wonder of place. When wildscaping we need to think, and as gardeners, as a gardener, I was trained in the idea of planting zones, and we still, most of the plants and everything we see is all about planting zones, but we need to think beyond that. And instead to get to know the ecozones and plant communities who thrive in them. And I'm in East, so 6E, Prince Edward County, and you can see all the different microzones within it. There's North, East, and South in Ontario here. Within East, there's a whole bunch of different ones, and within the South. And Stefan, I forget his last name, I don't see it on the screen here. He's done this just ecosystem mapping of plants in the 16 Mile Creek in Oakville, Ontario. And you can see the plants in the 16 Mile Creek in Oakville, and where at each section of this, and you can see elevation is one of the ways that really makes a difference in the eco sites and the different plant communities that live there. So starting to get to know, instead of our zone, the microsites and the conditions of those microsites. And I'm like this urban ecosite matrix, which was a summary content curated and designed by Sam Benville, Jonas Spring, Michaela Sutter, and I think I have the link in the reference that Astrid he could share. But these are the different plant communities that they've summarized into a table to make it much easier for us to choose the right one. And this was one of the suggestions, was asking yourself, is there a reference physical or biological landscape nearby? And so this is a patio, very dry step system. And if so, is there a place in the non-human outside the city that may be similar to this? And potentially here in the Kingston area of the Napanee Alvar in Ontario, we've got a lot of Alvars, and an Alvar community could be a good representative community. So even though it's not an Alvar, that might be a good community to mimic as you think about the planting design for it. And the United States Coast Guard, they have some extremely innovative landscaping on their site, and you can see at their headquarters they've designed both a savanna and an alvar ecosystem. And so if you were to visit that, you could walk around and be in the different ecosystems. And with the savanna, you can see raised it up, so there's the soil, and the alvar is actually a little bit submerged even, and very different plant communities as a result. Robin Wall Kimmer quotes an Indigenous elder who says, "Go slowly, listen to the land. It will tell you what to do. Go slowly, listen to the land." This was somebody in Kingston who 2 years ago decided they wanted to rewild their front lawn. And they originally had this, they had a lot of stress about it because they wanted it perfect. They thought that they needed to do a design and get it just right before they could do anything. And they smothered the grass with tarps. And then COVID hit. And they ended up designing a mix of food. So they went away from the initial design and did a mix of food and perennials and some colorful annuals just to get their neighbors. And this is very first season. This is not, 2 or 3 years later. And one of the things I like best about when they talked about it was not, they let go of the idea of perfection. They let go of the idea of the way to do it. And it became much more of a see what's happening, see what the land is becoming, and see also what their own needs are, and looking across those. Jeff Vandermeer, if you're on Twitter, I would highly recommend following Jeff Vandermeer. He's a fantasy author who started rewilding because he was depressed when Trump got elected, and this was something he thought he could do. And I love his tweets, which are almost all entirely about rewilding. And this is just a couple of examples. And so if you want to experience a whole different way of looking in a yard, follow him. And I think he's doing the most in Tallahassee for getting people to think differently about their yards than anybody. And it's simply from sharing of all the creatures that he's meeting. And he also immediately unfollows anybody who says he should treat his yard for grubs or, not have a pond because of mosquitoes, because he's doing it for all of the beings, not for himself. And just some of the ones I've learned about, like goldenrod, which Douglas Talmley has talked about as a keystone species, like the oak, in the perennial family, goldenrod is a keystone species. And one of the goals that the birds depend on over the winter. This spring, I discovered yellow-bellied sapsucker on my black walnut, and not knowing until I looked up the yellow-bellied sapsucker, identified it, that they take the sap from the trees, but that not just yellow-bellied sapsuckers, but a lot of the early pollinators and other creatures also use the sap from those trees. Or this giant black swallowtail, which I discovered in prickly ash in the forest. But its favorite species is the hop tree, which I have in my yard, and every year I see them flying around. I haven't found the caterpillars yet. I'm hoping one day I'll find some. The stopping tidying yards, stop breaking lawns, and finding the bumblebees that come and set up homes, or the Luna moths, or all the other moths that overwinter in the leaves. And this is from loosening control, stopping all of those interventions that we've been trained about. And if we're working with people, with the citizens out there, and trying to get them to fall in love, like see in your wild heart, see in your sight the wild. This is Thomas Rainier, and he wrote the Planting in the Post-Wild World, a book that has had a large influence on me. See in your sight the wild beating heart that wants to be expressed through planting. Break up with your lawn, as these cardboard signs say. And just not going to talk in these few images. Just think about, or not think, don't think, just feel. And feel the difference between this So we can reimagine, and I think once people start to feel it, the Wild Seed Project in the United States, they had a landscape architect doing some reimagining. So Portland before and after, a bank, and what a bank could become, someone's backyard, a food forest in a front yard. Just a strip mall, even a strip mall, what could happen? If we reclaim some of the large, vast parts of our city that have been allocated to car storage, what could we be doing there instead? Parks. And this is a couple in Smiths Falls who's been having an ongoing legal battle with the city about bylaw, which they have now won, and the city is settling with them and changing the bylaw because they naturalized their yard. Anna Singh says, meaningful sustainability requires multi-species research, and that is the remaking of livable landscapes through the actions of many organisms. So it's humans are part of it, and also inviting in and allowing all these other organisms, all these other creatures to help us convert our cities back to a regenerative place. And Thomas Rainier again says, wildness matters more now than it ever has. We're urbanizing at a pace unprecedented in human history. We have to look at the landscapes we live in as places where nature could be, or as I would say, multi-species refugia. What is magic, Abraham again, in its deepest sense, magic is an experience. It's the experience of finding oneself alive within a world that is itself alive. The experience of contact and community between oneself and something that is profoundly different from oneself, a swallow, a frog, a spider weaving its web. So that's wildscape at the individual scale. Again, that's my house in a very Moen neighborhood. At the neighborhood scale, and this is a street that's being redesigned in the United States. At the campus scale, a campus again, this one is in the States. Our Queens campus is very urban heat island, needing rewilding. Or ideally, even at the city scale, like Barcelona and Singapore, putting greenery at the center in urban planning, mobility, public health, sustainability, social rights, and culture. So this is like, and it truly is multi-species justice. And if anybody asks what the neighbors will think, because the neighbors will think something, depends who you're talking about as your neighbors. And I would say by the vast, vast majority will think it's awesome. So, and here's a final question. Rather than cultivating gardens, should we be cultivating gardeners? People who care and steward for these wild spaces.